Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to talk about using a filter in Photoshop for taking very dark photographs or very light photographs and bringing out the details in the shadows or the highlights. As you'll see, I have two pictures opened up. Basically they're the same picture. I have a JPEG taken in Venice, and I also have a Photoshop image of the same picture. You'll notice that in the for the JPEG it is 8-bit, and that's what this 8 represents here. And over here with the Photoshop document, I have 16-bit. It's always better if you're doing anything with photography to use a higher bit depth, because that gives you more details that even though you can't see them, it'll be easier to bring those details out. So we're going to work with the PSD file, and if you go to Filter, you'll see there's an option called Camera Raw Filter. We click on that, and it's going to bring up this utility. And with the options over here, we can change the exposure. And right away, by dragging this up, we can see a lot of the details that were almost black in the original are now being made more visible. The sky, however, is getting burnt out, but that's not an issue, because if we go a little bit further down to highlights, we can drag the highlights down, and that brings the details and the highlights right back in. So you're really not losing any kind of detail. We can go even further with shadows. If we wanted to bring in more of the shadow detail, we can drag that up. But you'll notice it's making the overall image look more exposed. So then we can come back up here to the exposure, bring that down if we want. And then again with the blacks, anything that's pure black or close to pure black, that will hopefully bring in more of the details in the black areas. Now right now, oh, by the way, this area up here is a histogram, and it shows where most of the pixels are, and as we can see, most of the pixels are on the left half of left half of this pictogram, which means that they're in the darker range of the photograph. If more pixels were over here, it would mean that in general, the picture is a light photograph. I'm just going to click on these little arrows here. And this isn't doing anything, but when I click here, you'll notice when I click here, we get a little bit of blue in this area here, in here, and in here. That means that right now, the way we have the slider set, these areas are still going to be pure black. And there's nothing wrong with that if the area is very dark anyway and you don't need to see those details. But if you were really concerned, you can keep playing with the sliders until you totally remove that, whatever was highlighted in blue. However, you'll notice to get rid of it, you're also burning out a lot of the highlight areas. And again, we can come back and play more with the highlights, making them darker. But again, you're bringing back the blue area in the blacks, or the blue highlighted areas here that show that those blacks are going to be pure black. So I'm just going to drag that back down a little bit, because it really doesn't matter to me if those blacks print as pure black or are represented as pure black on the screen. There are a couple of other things that we can look at here. Clarity helps to make the picture just more clear. And it also adds a little bit more contrast. So as we drag the slider up, well, let me drag it back down, you see it's less contrasty as I go to the left and more contrasty as I go to the right. And also up here, we also have a contrast slider. We can drag this up to the right. To the right makes it more contrasty, to the left makes it left contrasty. And you'll notice too, as I drag these sliders, the histogram is altered because the pixels, the values of those pixels are shifting to the darker or lighter areas. Okay, one other thing I wanted to go to, right now we are in the basic mode, and if we were to come over here to the effects mode, one of the options is dehaze, and what we can do is drag this slider. And basically dehaze is like if you're outside on a hazy day, this will cut some of that haze. And as you'll notice, it's also showing a lot of areas in the blacks that are going to be pure black, more so than before. If you don't like that, we can drag it back. But if you're trying to get a little less haze in the image, we can drag that to the right. And you'll notice this little pointer up here changed color, and that's basically telling us that these areas will be clipped and will just have a pure black instead of some value between black and white. But if we come back to basic, again, we can play with the blacks and the shadows and try and get that so there's a little less clipping. Now, a couple other things we can do with the Camera Raw filter is if you wanted to warm it up a little bit, we have the color temperature and tint, and we could make the image a little more warm if you wanted to make it look a little bit more like a sunset. I think that's a little too much, so I'm going to bring that back. Maybe just add a tiny bit of warmth, more warmth than there was in the original picture. And I think overall it's a little too exposed, so I'm going to bring that down a little bit. And sometimes when you play with these sliders, the picture tends to get a little flat color-wise. So if we were to come down to the bottom of these options in the basic panel, we have the vibrant slider, and we can drag that to the right to make it a little more vibrant, or to the left if you wanted to tone it down more. And saturation basically does the same thing as vibrance. It's just like vibrance on steroids, so you can really pop the colors. And I think that's way too much, so usually I don't play with the saturation. I just play with the vibrance a little bit to make it a little more vibrant. And that's pretty much it for the basics for using the Camera Raw filter. If we were to click on this little Y down here, we can see before and after. And I'm just going to click on this little button here to get rid of the warnings so we can see more easily the before and after shot. And sometimes once you do this, you can look and say, well, you know what, some things I like the way the sky is really kind of glowing. So if you wanted that effect, we can come back to the highlights, drag that up a little bit more, maybe to add a little more darkness in the shadows. We can drag that down a little more. So we're really getting a sense that it's evening. And once you're happy, you just say OK. It takes a second for it to process, and there you go.